Check out carmarshal.com. The link is in the description. They help support us.
A Herald Tribune investigative report. We hurt a lot of people. Data review confirms Broward more punitive toward black defendants. By Josh Salmon. Josh.Salmon@heraldtribune.com. Vexed by a Herald Tribune investigation showing Broward County sentences blacks busted in drug-free zones to more prison time than whites, prosecutors disputed the findings. The newspaper must have erred, they said. But a month-long review by the Herald Tribune and State Attorney's Office found Broward County zone records are riddled with errors that court clerks passed along to the Florida Department of Corrections, which supplied data to the newspaper under public records requests in 2016. Those mistakes caused the newspaper to overstate racial disparities for defendants convicted in Broward's drug-free zones in its December Series 1 War. 2 races. The original data showed. See Hurt, A12. Hurt. From page A1. Broward County's 17th Circuit incarcerates black defendants for an average of 5 times as long as whites busted in a drug-free zone. The corrected data shows black offenders spend triple the time in lockup on average. Broward prosecutors acknowledge the disparity is a problem, and they intend to meet with black pastors, community groups, and law enforcement to address the issue. We will seek their input to weigh the quality of life and safety issues that come with living in lower socioeconomic areas exposed to drug violence, Jeff Marcus, Chief Assistant State Attorney for the 17th Circuit, wrote in an email to the newspaper. It is important to consider the opinions of the people who live and work in the communities affected by street sales of drugs. The Herald Tribune reviewed more than 700 cases in Broward and found prosecutors helped negotiate sentences for white defendants charged in drug-free zones that averaged 233 days in lockup. Blacks averaged 684 days or 3 times as long. The 17th Circuit State Attorney offices blamed the disparities on blacks having longer records and previous stints in prison. They said many of the drug arrests involving blacks happen on the streets and in the open, bringing violent ancillary crime. Prosecutors also criticized the Herald Tribune for comparing defendants by the number of points they scored on their sentencing guidelines. The system was set up to ensure equality, but Broward prosecutors said in written statements and in a phone interview that points are not what govern their recommendations. Instead, they emphasize prior criminal history. As a result, whites who commit more serious crimes are shown leniency over black defendants with longer criminal records. We did it wrong for a very long time, Broward Public Defender Howard Finkelstein said. And we hurt a lot of people who did not need to be hurt. Finkelstein blasted drug-free zones as archaic, ineffective, and discriminatory. He was not surprised by the racial disparities in his circuit. It's time for the system to change, Finkelstein said. It's stacked against people of color. Prior record is already quantified in the points. Florida legislators adopted drug-free zones amid crack's reign in 1987. The law increases the severity of drug offenses within 1,000 feet of schools, parks, churches, convenience stores, and public housing. The Herald Tribune analyzed these sentencing enhancements based on the number of points defendants scored on their criminal guidelines score sheets, the formula used in Florida to calculate criminal punishments. Reporters identified at least a dozen instances in Broward where white defendants were shown extraordinary leniency compared with groups of blacks, who scored almost exactly the same number of points but were given much more incarceration. In each cluster, whites were sentenced to just a few months in jail or no lockup at all, while blacks were far more likely to see punishments on par with the minimum established by law. For some, that meant more than 5 years behind bars. The Herald Tribune reviewed each of the drug-free zone convictions in Broward where the defendant scored 44 points or above, qualifying them for some state prison under the guidelines. Nearly half of the whites to score above 44 points got no time at all, even though their sentencing guidelines said they could have. That rate of leniency drops to just a quarter for blacks. At the same time, 61 black defendants were each sentenced to more than 3 months longer than the lowest permissible sentence listed on the score sheet, indicating the court showed little mercy. That's about 14% of the 445 blacks convicted of drug-free zone enhancements since 2004. But just 3 of the 57 white defendants convicted of a drug-free zone enhancement were sentenced to more than 3 months longer than what their score sheets recommended. That represents just 5% of the total. Prosecutors in the 17th Circuit attributed their sentencing disparities to the discretion of law enforcement, which controls the number of minorities arrested and brought into the criminal justice system. For every white defendant charged in a Broward County drug-free zone, there are 6 blacks convicted under the enhancement. People drive into these neighborhoods to buy their drugs. They're open and notorious, Marcus told the Herald Tribune during a 45-minute phone interview. It's not hard for police to watch and make arrests, so that's what they do. Sometimes it's within 1,000 feet of a school or park. In higher socioeconomic communities, these drug deals aren't taking place. And with these drug deals comes murders, rip-offs and activity people don't like in their neighborhood. Broward prosecutors argue that the newspaper's review did not adequately take into account a defendant's past. They said the longer a defendant's rap sheet, the more punitive their recommendation, regardless of the sentencing score. They say just because defendants score the same number of points at sentencing, it does not mean they should expect similar punishments. The premise of your story is that people with equal points should be treated the same, Marcus wrote in an email. Your story does not take into account the prior record points of the individuals you have asked us to compare or whether the offender has previously been to prison. But other lawyers and criminologists point out that prior records are already built into the point scoring system. They told the Herald Tribune that if one criminal had a more severe offense, but not a very long criminal record, it is acceptable to compare them with another defendant who received the bulk of the points through priors after committing a minor crime, especially when comparing hundreds of cases. The bottom line is they have a prior record that is scored on the guidelines and helps determine the sentence, said James Unnever, a professor of criminology at the University of South Florida Sarasota Manatee. The prior record is already quantified in the points. Criminal defense attorneys argue that the entire justification for the point system is to assign measurable values to circumstances like offense severity and prior record to come up with a fair sentence that takes all of the factors into account. The idea is to punish criminals in Pensacola the same as those in Key West, no matter their race, gender, or wealth. There's no way you can say with a straight face that by and large, people with similar scores should not receive similar sentences, said Derek Bird, a prominent criminal defense lawyer in Sarasota. That's the whole purpose. It's why they did this. The purpose of the guidelines is to promote consistency in sentencing. It seems more than coincidental that it is minorities always having these long sentences. I don't see how they escape that. It's just not fair. Raymond Williams was at the Alley Cat Bar and Grill in Hollywood, FLA, when he approached undercover detectives working for the Vice, Intelligence, and Narcotics Unit. The 45-year-old white man introduced himself, pulled out a prescription bottle from his pocket and sold 3 opioid painkillers to the detectives for $20. The undercover buyers purchased more pills from him for another $20 later that night. Williams told them he was waiting for an 8-ball, 3.5 grams, of cocaine to be delivered. When the drugs arrived, Williams kept asking the detectives to join him in the restroom to snort a line, according to police reports. As last call neared, Williams handed one of the detectives a small baggie of cocaine, insisting he did not want money for it, only for the men to buy him a beer. Law enforcement ordered him a $5 Stella Artois. The bar was too dark, loud, and smoky for recording devices, but detectives had other members of their unit stationed outside. They charged Williams with 2 counts of selling hydromorphone, 2 counts of selling oxycodone and 1 count of selling cocaine. Detectives noted on their arresting paperwork that the deal took place 105 feet from Young Circle Park and 800 feet from the Hollywood Academy of Arts and Sciences, enhancing the transaction to a more serious first-degree felony. Williams scored 169.8 points on his sentencing guidelines. That takes into account the severity of the bust at the Hollywood bar in February 2014, as well as his prior misdemeanor convictions for assault, theft, carrying a concealed weapon, driving with a suspended license, public intoxication, and disorderly conduct. A score of 169.8 equates to a lowest permissible sentence of nearly 9 years in state prison. Prosecutors instead agreed to a deal that called for 90 days in county jail, followed by the leniency of house arrest and probation, which Williams later violated. The state attorney's office did not list a reason for the downward departure on the score sheet. Correctional records show that since 2011, at least 8 black defendants scored roughly the same number of points as Williams for drug-free zone convictions. Not one received the same mercy. Their punishments ranged from 2 to 8 years in prison. Consider Ernest Lewis. The 37-year-old black man was busted in 2013 for selling $10 worth of cocaine to a confidential informant within 1,000 feet of Walker Elementary School in Fort Lauderdale, court records show. Lewis took the informant to a nearby dealer's house, and the undercover buyer handed the money directly to the other man. Lewis scored 170 points on his score sheet, taking into account multiple priors for cocaine, theft, driving with a suspended license, burglary, and other offenses. He wrote a letter to the court, begging for help with addiction. He said he wanted to turn his life around for the sake of his 2 kids, pleading to avoid a return to prison. "I do have a problem with drug using, and I've asked the courts for help in the past, never to receive any," Lewis wrote in the June 2014 letter. He went on to say that he'd been accepted into treatment at First Step Behavioral Health in Broward. "Mr. Marty from First Step approved me to go there," Lewis wrote to the judge. "Would you put me on probation and go to the program, so I can get help?" Citing his lengthy record, prosecutors and judges instead labeled the black man a habitual offender and gave him 6 years behind bars for the $10 drug deal. If a black person is 980 feet from a school or church, and a white person is 2, they should be prosecuted and treated the same, said Barry Butin, a criminal defense lawyer who volunteers with the ACLU of Broward County. Any rational lawyer, even if they're not a member of the ACLU, will oppose these disparities. It's just not fair. The state attorney's office defended its sentencing recommendations. See Hurt, A14. Public defender Howard Finkelstein, a critic of drug-free zones, said the system is stacked against people of color. Carlin Jean / Sun Sentinel. Raymond Williams, left, and Ernest Lewis scored similar points at sentencing. Williams served 90 days in jail, followed by house arrest and probation. Lewis was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Hurt. From page A12. Prosecutors called the examples of disparate treatment highlighted by the Herald Tribune unpersuasive. Your premise that Mr. Williams, who had no felony record, and Mr. Lewis, who was an habitual offender with 10 prior felony convictions, should be treated the same just because they end up with the same points is unreasonable, defies common sense, and does not comport with Florida law, Marcus wrote. The fact that they had the same number of points was not determinative, as it does not take into account mitigating circumstances that may apply to Mr. Williams and prior prison sentences and an extensive prior record for Mr. Lewis. They gave bad data to the state. The issues in Broward go beyond drug enforcement and into the circuit's record keeping. While reporting its Series 1 War 2 races. In 2017, the Herald Tribune relied on data from the Florida Department of Corrections to measure racial disparities in sentencing. The state government databank contains information on the names of defendants, the crime in question, the points scored and the punishment. In Broward County, the data is laden with errors. The Herald Tribune opened all 721 records in Broward and found clerks entered sentences incorrectly in 175 cases, or nearly a quarter of the total. In one instance, clerks entered a sentence of 650 years instead of 65. The mistakes in Broward also include 19 cases in which judges first sentenced defendants to anywhere from 15 to 65 years in prison. Then, a month or so later, they shortened those punishments to around 3 years. All of the defendants were black, and their sentences were never adjusted in prison records. Some judges have the practice of temporarily releasing jailed defendants, after they have pled to the charges, before they go off to prison, said Constance Jones Simmons, spokeswoman for the 17th Circuit State Attorney's Office. In order to make sure they will return, the judge first sentences them to 30 years. When they return to court on a designated date, the sentence gets reduced to the more reasonable number of, say, 3 years. If they do not return, the 30 years sticks when they are eventually rearrested. A dock spokesman said the state relies on clerks in each county to enter accurate information and to train their employees accordingly. The state provides 3 pages of instructions for the court system on proper data entry for sentencing score sheets. But there's no audit at the corrections level. Diane Diaz, Chief Operations Officer for the Broward County Clerk of Courts, told the Herald Tribune that her office stands by its records. She agreed to review the potential errors, noted that it would take time. Many of these cases predate e-filing and they all predate the current administration, Diaz wrote in an email to the Herald Tribune. The images of the actual court orders that we would need to perform the analysis are not available electronically and exist in paper in the archived paper file. This is not a small project. In other parts of Florida, the records were far less messy. The Herald Tribune reviewed more than 700 drug-free zone cases in Jacksonville's 4th Circuit and more than 200 in Pensacola's 1st Circuit. Less than 5% of those records contained errors. The 5% rule is generally a good one, said John Kramer, a professor emeritus of sociology and criminology at Pennsylvania State University. Once corrected, the Herald Tribune found that the 4th Circuit sentences blacks to more than twice as long in lockup as white defendants convicted of felonies within drug-free zones. The 1st Circuit sentences blacks to 4 times as long. The Herald Tribune originally reported a higher ratio for the 4th Circuit, but the ratio for the 1st Circuit is the same. Broward County is trying to hide behind the fact that they gave bad data to the state, Kramer said. But that's a fallacy. The data reflects what the court system told the corrections system. Pushback from judges. Experts point to the errors in Broward as a reason for why better data collection is needed in the criminal justice system. With improved data, prosecutors and the judiciary could better measure disparities and their role in perpetuating them. A bill proposing exactly that failed to advance through the Senate Judiciary Committee last year following pushback from judges in Sarasota's 12th Circuit Court, who now say they support the measure. That legislation was proposed in response to the newspaper's Bias on the Bench series, published in December 2016. Senator Audrey Gibson, D. Jacksonville, was ready to revive the bill this year but said she's still facing backlash from the judiciary and could not find a co-sponsor in the House of Representatives. There's still pushback from the judges, to be honest, Gibson said. There just isn't much of an appetite for it. There are also roadblocks in the Senate Judiciary Committee. I haven't heard from anybody in the state that that's something they feel is necessary moving forward, said Senator Greg Steube, R. Sarasota, who chairs the committee. Others believe better data would mean more transparency and accountability, helping to bridge many of the racial disparities uncovered by the Herald Tribune. Whatever the process, it's vital for Florida's lawmakers and the judicial system to address racial disparities with better data and a comprehensive assessment of the factors that determine outcomes, said Deborah Brodsky, director of Florida State University's Project on Accountable Justice. Herald Tribune political editor Zach Anderson contributed to this report. State Senator Audrey Gibson, D. Jacksonville, said she hoped to revive a bill this session that would require better data collection on sentencing by race, but there just isn't much of an appetite for it. AP Archive/Steve Cannon.
County, this is Charlotte County COPWATCH, and I wanted to explain what fair use is. You can use pieces of news articles if you're doing it for news reporting, you have commentary, and you're doing it for education purposes. So that's what fair use is, as you can see right here. Another reason why I wanted to make this video is to let you know I have just joined with Patreon. A nice thing with Patreon, I make no money on YouTube. They took the money away years ago, and so this is another way to give, and it's a nice thing too because you can give monthly. You can give $1, $5, $10, whatever. I do 4 to 5 hours a day on trying to wake the sheep up on how corrupt it is and different ways that you can fight the corruption. So Patreon is a way that you can do it, and then of course the old way is still there. Donate to Charlotte County COPWATCH with PayPal or credit card. So keep that in mind. 4 to 5 hours a day. I make no money, but the corruption happened to me and I'm sick of it, so I'm trying to wake people up. But my wife would love it if some, if we could get some help out there. There's 47,000 subscribers. Just think if each one of you subscribers just gave a, let's say, actually, yes, $1 a month. 47,000 subscribers gave $1 a month. That would be awesome. That's not going to happen. But anyways, that would be great if it did happen. But, do the math in your head. Just think about it. Like I said, 4 to 5 hours a day. I get no money from YouTube. YouTube has gone nuts. You can't do anything anymore. They're taking the money away everywhere. So these are a couple different ways that you can still help out with all this time that I put in. And as you know, I'm in a special situation where, at least I can do it, 4 to 5 hours a day. We have a cleaning company during the day. That's what allows me to do this, and we're debt-free. So this is my hobby. I don't go fishing and all that other crap. I try to save the world. So help me out to make the wife happy, man. In fact, if you guys did give $1 a day, and there was 47,000 of you, and you did it, and each of you gave $1, and that was every month, oh my God, yes, I could quit. I could start suing them. Another idea too that we have is, if I got, some funds, we could actually contact everyone that has been ticketed and or arrested and put in jail and start sending them postcards to let them know we're here, and to see if everything went all right, and if it didn't, find out their story. So we could even do more investigations and more lawsuits. Lawsuits take money. So just think about that. 47,000 of you so far right now. $1 a day. $1 a month on Patreon, or $5 a month Patreon, 10, 20, whatever. Just do the math in your head. Help out. This is a lot of work every single day. Thanks.